Dr. Hossein Mousavian is a research scholar at the Program on Science and Global Security in Princeton University. He's a former diplomat who served as Iran's ambassador to Germany from 1990 to 1997, head of the Foreign Relations Committee of Iran's National Security Council from 1997 to 2005, and spokesman for Iran in its nuclear negotiations with the European Union from 2003 to 2005. He joins me now from Princeton University. Dr. Mousavian, how hopeful are you that the current visit of the IAEA inspectors to Tehran could break the deadlock?
I'm not very much hopeful because the IAEA's mandate is on technical issues, while the Iranian nuclear issue is not a technical issue, is completely a political issue. The IAEA has no power, no authority to discuss, negotiate, and agree on the political issues. The IAEA demands from Iran is, first, they require Iran to implement additional protocol. They want more access. Currently, Iran is a member of Safeguard Agreement and is in full compliance with the IAEA in the framework of the Safeguard Agreement. But the IAEA, it's about 5, 6, 7 years, reiterating on implementation of additional protocol. First, from November 2011, the IAEA has some possible military dimension issues. The second requirement the IAEA has is Iran to cooperate with the IAEA to address the possible military dimension issues. To address these possible military dimension issues requires Iran to give access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol, practically unlimited access. In case Iran is prepared to go for it, the IAEA has no power, no authority on the reciprocity measures. That's why I believe this has been a mistake to have first IAEA in Tehran, second to have Iran and the P5+1 meeting. I believe it would have been much more wise to have first Iran and the P5+1 meeting to agree on a comprehensive package or on a step-by-step plan, to agree on the political side of the issues, and then give the mandate to IAEA to go to Tehran to agree with Iran on the technical issues.
Dr. Mousavian, but you know, the people are saying the IAEA has its own issues, P5+1 has other matters to deal with. Should Iran let inspectors visit Parchin military complex?
To visit Parchin, it requires Iran practically to implement additional protocol. For Iran to implement additional protocol, definitely Tehran would ask for reciprocity. They cannot implement additional protocol for nothing. I believe the P5+1 understands very well that any deal with Iran requires two major issues from the P5+1. First, to recognize the rights of Iran for enrichment.
But you know that before Iran gave the permission to IAEA to visit the same facility. Why not doing it again?
Because this all should come in one package. Iran cannot unilaterally go to implement additional protocol, because the maximum expectation of the IAEA and the P5+1 is implementation of additional protocol, and definitely the IAEA in Tehran, they would ask Iran to cooperate with the IAEA to address the possible military dimension issues, which would require Iran to give access beyond additional protocol. That's why I reiterate, we need a political package for Iran to accept to implement additional protocol, for Iran to cooperate with the IAEA to address all possible military dimension issues, to remove all ambiguities, technical ambiguities on Iranian nuclear program, and for the P5+1 to recognize the legitimate rights of Iran on their NPT and to lift the sanctions, even gradually.
Are they sanitizing the site? The Parchin military?
I really don't believe during our time the IAEA had the same claims and they came to Iran. They visited 2 times the Parchin site, and finally they understood all speculations, rumors.
But they didn't visit the building that it's under the suspicion.
Always when they want to visit, they bring some issues. They say this building or that building. During our time also, they named some buildings. And they said, we are very much suspicious. We have reports here, there are illegal activities. We gave them access to the Parchin 2 times. It was the time we were implementing additional protocol. I should remind you one very important issue. Based on the legislation passed by Iranian parliament, Majlis, the government of Iran can implement additional protocol if and when the world powers recognize the rights of Iran for enrichment. Therefore, Iran has no problem to implement additional protocol. That's why I believe this is not the authority and the power of the IAEA to agree with Iran. They have no authority. The P5+1, in one package, they should accept the rights of Iran for enrichment, and in return, in reciprocation, Iran also accept to implement additional protocol. And then we have possible military dimension issues, which requires Iran to give access beyond additional protocol. But I believe Iran also would be ready to go for it. Based on my understanding, Iran has no problem to cooperate with the IAEA to address possible military dimension issues. But in reciprocation, the P5+1 also should be ready simultaneously, in parallel, to take steps for gradual removal of sanctions. They cannot expect Iran unilaterally to accept everything with no reciprocation.
But this is Dr. Mousavian, this is a technical issue. It seems that if any suspicious activities that take place in Parchin, it appears to be that it's not the case any longer. So why not come clean? After all, it is a priority for the IAEA. This is a purely technical issue. I know that you're trying to say it has something to do with the political matters, but why not come clean? It's about the past.
No, first of all, to cooperate with the IAEA's requirements, as I said, they would have to accept to implement additional protocol. Tens of countries, even today, they have not accepted additional protocol. They do not implement additional protocol. No one can force a nation, a country, to implement a treaty. Therefore, this is a voluntary decision by Iran. This is a goodwill by Iran to decide to implement additional protocol. Iran, as I said, is member of Safeguard Agreement, and they are in full compliance with within the Safeguard Agreement. But additional protocol is an international arrangement which many countries, 50, 60, 70 countries, even today, they have not been ready to ratify or even to sign additional protocol. Therefore, this is not a simple issue, as you say, that this is technical issue and they should go for it.
Dr. Mousavian,
this is the maximum.
Yeah, I got your point. I know that you made it clear that Iran accept to some sort of removal of sanctions, but my understanding is the West, the international community, has no issue with enrichment in Iran. It's the matter of to what level Iran is going to enrich uranium. But the question I have is, what impact does President Obama's re-election have on how Iran approaches negotiations?
As far as I understand, the civil service at State Department and in the White House, they have concluded since 2010, any solution ultimately should include the rights of Iran for enrichment and also lifting the sanctions. But the administration has been struggling with this solution to go to compromise in a package based on these two elements, because there is no consensus in Washington. Washington is completely disputed. Congress is resisting recognition the recognition of the rights of Iran first, and at the same time, Congress is continuously increasing sanctions and pressures. Therefore, Obama administration is power, I believe, is limited because he is challenged very strongly by Congress.
Even in his second term?
We need a consensus. I believe so, because just right after his election, we had 2-3 weeks ago a new legislation increasing the sanctions on Iran. Although White House still has not gone forward with this for implementation of this legislation, but the Congress demonstrated its position to Obama after election, that we want only sanctions and pressures. We need, first of all, a consensus in Washington. This is the first issue.
Is there a consensus in
Second
Tehran?
issue, definitely there is no consensus in Tehran, but there is one ultimate decision maker in Tehran. Even if administration and parliament, they have disputes, when the supreme leader decides, everybody would follow. I mean, the advantage Tehran has, despite of all disputes within the system between parliament, administration, there is an ultimate decision maker, which is the supreme leader. But here we don't have such a consensus, and we don't have such an ultimate decision maker in Washington. This is one problem. The second problem, the P5+1 is disputed. What I know, based what I heard from reliable sources, Washington and Europeans, they have tried to modify the step-by-step package, the step-by-step plan presented to Tehran in Baghdad meeting some month ago, but Russia is resisting the new modified plan because it has been very, very, very little modified. It has no major stake for Iran. The reason is the Obama's administration has no power to lift the sanctions. This is the power and the authority of Congress, and Congress is not going to do it.
But the White House, you know that they have the authority to not implement those sanctions, and it's been mentioned in the legislation on Iran sanctions. It's been given to the president the authority to not implement those sanctions. But I know that you're against the sanctions, but have sanctions impeded Iran's nuclear program or slowed down the program?
Yeah, as you said, I have been always against sanctions and rhetorics on war. I believe threatening Iran with war and increasing sanctions up to now has been completely counterproductive for a peaceful solution. Just because of sanctions, Iran has increased capability and enrichment. Look, in 2006, Iran had a very little stockpile of enriched uranium. Today, after 4 or 5 years, after 4 or 5 resolutions, sanction resolutions, Iran has 7,000 kilograms of enriched uranium. In 2005, 2006, Iran had about 1,000 centrifuges. After all these sanctions, today, Iran has 10,000 centrifuges. Therefore, even the level of enrichment, that time, Iran was enriching at the level of 3.5%. After sanctions, Iran is enriching at the level of 20%. Therefore, what I can say, I mean, the reason I'm against sanctions is first, the sanctions are harming the people, the innocent people, the ordinary people. Second, I'm 100% convinced that the world powers would not be able to compel Iran to comply with their demands through sanctions.
So they don't make any concessions, you think, by all those tightening sanctions, economic sanctions, Iran as
no,
some
exactly,
serious issue?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, this would be vice versa, because Iranian political behavior is completely different under threats and pressures. If they want Iran to be more flexible and cooperative, they should understand Iran cannot show flexibility and cooperation under threats and sanctions. This is what the world powers, especially the Western powers, they do not understand about the realities inside Iran.
Ambassador
They believe if they
Mousavian,
increase sanctions and pressures, they would get Iran to agree to change its nuclear policy. It's not going to happen.
Ambassador Mousavian, some people believe the quantity of enrichment that you describe Iran is conducting is beyond its need and demands. What need does Iran have for enrichment on this scale, and are the cost of it justified?
First of all, I don't believe even Iranian administration is convinced about the cost of the enrichment due to all these sanctions and pressures. But we should be realistic. There has never been a realistic package proposed by the P5+1 to Iran. Up to now, all the packages have proposed to Iran have not including lifting sanctions and recognition of the rights of Iran for enrichment. Up to now, the P5+1 has never proposed such a package, first. Second, for one civilian nuclear power plant, let's say Bushehr, we need 27,000 tons of enriched uranium, 3.5%. Today, Iran has 7,000 tons. Therefore, Iran has a lot to do more in order to have enough stockpile for one civilian nuclear power plant.
Mr. Mousavian, you know that Russia has agreed to deliver the nuclear for Bushehr reactor.
I agree with you completely, but Iran is going to has decided to have more nuclear power plant. Practically, if you remember, during 1960s, 70s, it was in 1970s, it was the US proposed Iran to have 23 nuclear power plants within the year 2000. It was the US proposal. Now Iran has decided to go for 10, 20 power plants. Therefore, even Russians, they have accepted, and there is agreement to provide the fuel for Bushehr, but Iran has more power plant in agenda.
But the Bushehr even haven't activated yet, Dr. Mousavian. I mean, what
yeah,
of
course.
Yeah,
of course. See, my point is here. If there is a political agreement, if the IAEA normalize Iranian file within the IAEA, and the world powers, they normalize Iranian file in United Nations Security Council, then these calculations would be different. In Iranian political and security calculation would be completely different. But you should also have in mind that Iran is not going to rely on one country for fuel forever. Iran has decided to have its own independence, to produce and provide fuel, even partially. This is exactly because right after revolution, when Iran had no decision to have enrichment, Shah had decided to have enrichment, Shah had decided to have recycling, reprocessing, Shah had decided to have 23 power plant, and everyone knows Shah had decided to have nuclear bomb. But right after revolution, they decided to shrink the ambitious nuclear projects of the Shah. They decided not to have enrichment. They decided not to have reprocessing. They decided not to have nuclear bomb. But unfortunately, Americans and Europeans withdraw from their contracts with Iran unilaterally against NPT and against all international law. The US stopped to provide Tehran research reactor with fuel rods. And France stopped enrichment agreement signed with Iran. Iran paid $1.2 billion to France. But France unilaterally canceled the contract. If the US had provided a fuel rod for Tehran research reactor, if Germans have completed Bushehr power plant, if France has continued its consortium with Iran on enrichment, because it was supposed to be produced inside France, not inside Iran. And this consortium in France was supposed to provide the fuel for Bushehr power plant. If they had been committed, if they had remained committed to their contractual agreements at the beginning, at the early days of revolution, definitely Iran would have not gone for enrichment.
There are so many ifs.
They pushed Iran.
Of course, there are so many ifs into this, and I'm sure you noticed that as far as I understand, Ayatollah Khomeini was, or at least the leadership in Iran after the revolution, who stopped the nuclear program. They didn't want that program to be continued, but after probably the war between Iran and Iraq, they restarted the program. But the issue is the matter of trust. Given the history of mistrust and the lack of confidence on both sides, how can Iran ensure the US that its intentions are peaceful, especially since Iran's nuclear activities restarted covertly with individuals such as Abdul Qadir Khan in Pakistan?
Look, exactly the problem is with the logic you mentioned just now. You believe Iran should convince the US and the European and the West that they are not after nuclear bomb. I agree with you, the mistrust is a major issue, but we should understand the mistrust is mutual. Iran is member of NPT. Based even on national intelligence estimate of the United States, which all other countries in the world, they agree, except Israel, Iran does not have nuclear bomb. Iran has not decided to make nuclear bomb.
But they had the program.
Of course, why not?
So they had the program to build the bomb, but they stopped it at certain point.
No. This is 10 years. The IAEA is supervising 24 hours a day with their cameras all Iranian nuclear activities. And each 3 months, the IAEA during last 10, 11 years has released its statement or resolution or the Director General report reiterating there is no evidence of diversion in Iranian nuclear
I'm referring
program.
to the NIA estimate that you mentioned. It's been said that Iran had the nuclear program but stopped it at certain point. That was the what.
This is the matter of dispute. They say Iran has stopped in 2003, but they agree Iran today neither has nuclear bomb and nor has decided to make nuclear bomb. And the IAEA also repeatedly has reiterated there is no evidence of diversion. But we were talking about the mistrust. This is a major point. You should remember, right after revolution, Iraq invaded Iran. Saddam Hussein was after disintegration of Iran and the US and Europeans, they supported the aggressor. They supported the aggressor to bring regime change and to disintegrate Iran. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapon. Iranians, they are victim of weapons of mass destruction. And unfortunately, technology and material for chemical weapon was provided by Europeans and Americans. And then you believe Iran should convince the US and Europeans and should try to attract their trust. No, this is a mutual mistrust, and both parties should try to make appropriate measure to bring confidence in each side. This is the major point, first. Second, as long as we don't have a comprehensive package on the nuclear, we are not going to get to anywhere. The IAEA has no authority. The IAEA has been used as political instrument. The day the P5+1 agrees with Iran, the IAEA can finish the technical issues within a week, believe me. I know the IAEA, I have worked with them, and even today, if Iran gives them access in the framework of additional protocol, and even beyond additional protocol, the IAEA has no authority to announce that all the problems have been removed, because they have to report it to the Board of Governors, and the world powers in the Board of Governors decide, not Mr. Amano or the civil servant people at the IAEA. They are just employees. The world powers, they are sitting in the Board of Governors and they decide. Therefore, IAEA is just an employee, nothing more.
Dr. Mousavian, you made it very clear that you pointed out on sanctions and on enrichment. But what Iran is going to offer?
I believe what Iran can offer, the maximum level of transparency internationally exists. Iran can be committed to the maximum level of transparency and cooperation with the IAEA to remove all ambiguities, remained ambiguities, first. Second, Iran can show more goodwills, because transparency would not resolve everything. Let's be very frank and realistic. Iranians, they would need to compromise on some limitations on the level and capacity of enrichment. The level of enrichment, for example, Iran should ultimately accept to limit the level of enrichment to below 5%. This is beyond transparency. I mean, one measure, one set of measures relates to transparency, which I said, what Iran can offer the IAEA, we would be ready to go up to the end of transparency.
But are they going to close the Fordo facility?
No, it doesn't mean. Transparency has nothing to do with closing Fordo. See, you are mixing everything, because transparency has nothing to do with suspension. Transparency means Iran should give access to IAEA for any inspections they require. If you want to have 10 enrichment sites, you are permitted under the NPT. You can have 10 enrichment sites. This is the legitimate rights of every member.
Under the mountain?
Here, of course, when the Israelis every day, they threatening Iran to attack, and they push the US and Europeans to bring a military strike against Iran. If you are responsible in Tehran, of course you would go to build a facility to preserve your assets, of course. I mean, Iranians, they have been very wise. Every
But it's a
country
very
would do it.
questionable, you know
But-
that
but-
it's been very questionable facility. It's a very limited facility. It's not as large as Natanz, as an industrial.
No, let's say, let me agree with you, this is questionable. But it is nothing illegal, first. Second, under the framework of NPT, you can have enrichment, 1 enrichment site, 10 enrichment site, 100, under the sea, under the mountain. There is no limitation. But the ambiguity or the questions would be resolved only through transparency, only with full cooperation of Iran and the IAEA. When Fordow is 100% under IAEA surveillance, even today it is the case, Fordow is under IAEA surveillance. But for the future also, if Iran is going to guarantee 100% transparency and cooperation, therefore there should remain no more questions. But I said transparency would not resolve all the issues.
Dr.
The
Mousavian,
second part of the problem is with the breakout capability.
yeah, sorry for interrupting.
For-
I know you're pointing a very important issue. I would like to ask this question because it would follow the discussion. In your writings, you have mentioned that the nuclear arms are forbidden according to Islamic laws and even Ayatollah Khamenei's own word. Does a nuclear fatwa exist on paper, and what guarantees are there that Ayatollah Khamenei will not issue another fatwa reversing his previously stated position if the country feels threatened?
First of all, what does mean a fatwa? Fatwa means a point of view of religious scholar, a grand ayatollah. This is the fatwa. Whether this is written or orally or even an office of a grand ayatollah can inform the point of view or fatwa of a religious leader or a grand ayatollah first. But on this nuclear fatwa, first of all, in a conference, NPT conference, Peaceful Nuclear Technology for Everyone, nuclear bomb for no one. In Tehran, it was, I think, in 2010, 2011. The conference inauguration was through official statement of Supreme Leader first. Second, just some month ago, the heads of about 120 countries, about 40, 50 countries, they participated in non-alignment movement conference in Tehran at the level of the heads of countries and the rest at the level of foreign ministers or so. The leader personally in front of the 2/3 of international community personally officially stated his fatwa. And third, Iranian mission has registered the leader's fatwa written officially by the United Nations. This is the first time ever in the history of United Nations a religious fatwa has been registered. Therefore, I really disagree with those who question the credibility of fatwa. And this fatwa is not something new. But you should have in mind, during the war, invasion of Iraq, the time Saddam Hussein used chemical weapon, 100,000 Iranians, they were either killed or injured. Iranian military officials, they asked Imam Khomeini to reciprocate with chemical weapon. He did not give permission to reciprocate. I believe when a country during war, exactly the time the enemy has used weapons of mass destruction, tens of thousands of civilians have been killed, and a religious leader put a ban for its military to reciprocate. This is the most credible evidence about the authenticity and legitimacy of such a fatwa.
Dr. Mousavian, you know that Ayatollah Khamenei has publicly said that if Iran gives in on its nuclear aspirations, then the West will target Iran on human rights issue and so on. Is the Supreme Leader genuinely worried that compromise will eventually lead to the end of the Islamic Republic and the West?
No, this is not something new. I have been in Iranian foreign ministry for a quarter century. In every period, the US has brought up an issue. One day, they have made terrorism #1 issue worldwide, mobilizing the international community to put pressure. Another during, for example, President Rafsanjani in mid-1990s, they brought the peace process as #1 issue to mobilize the international community, blaming Iran that Iran is disturbing the peace process. Iran is threat #1 to the peace and security in the Middle East because Iran is obstacling the peace process. Today, everyone understands this is not, and this was not Iran obstacling the peace process. This has been Prime Minister Netanyahu as the main obstacle to two-state solution and to peace process. It was not Iran, and it is not Iran. Today we have nuclear issue, and if in case the nuclear issue is resolved, I'm also personally convinced, just due to my own experience, the US would bring up another issue. That's why during my time, my work at Foreign Ministry, and the 3 years I'm here, in my lectures, conferences, op-eds, all the time I have reiterated on a two-track policy. Not the two-track President Obama is following, sanctions, pressures, and diplomacy. I'm against this two-track policy. My two-track policy is as follows. First, a realistic package, as I explained, for the nuclear issue through the P5+1 talks with Iran. At the same time, in parallel, a comprehensive package through a direct negotiation and talks between Tehran and Washington. I believe the nuclear issue is a subsidiary issue of the hostilities between Tehran and Washington. As long as these hostilities are going on, as long as these hostilities are increasing, I really cannot imagine we would be able to find a solution for Iranian nuclear dilemma.
Mr. Mousavian, we have very limited time, but probably 2 minutes or so. What has led you to decide to return to Iran this summer? Is it to coincide with the Ahmadinejad leaving the presidency?
No. I was living in Iran. I was arrested in April 2007. The final court decision was in April 2008, but I stayed in Iran until August 2009. But based on the court decision, they gave me 5 years ban on diplomatic posts and any activity on international relations within Iran, inside Iran. I should have just sitting in my home for 5 years. That's why I just came for my academic works, and I would return after the verdict is over.
Last question I have is, we don't see a lot of debates inside Iran about their own nuclear program. Why has this topic been so muted inside the country?
Because today there is a consensus inside the country that it is just a political issue. And the P5+1 is not in position to launch a real deal to break this deadlock. Exactly the reason I told you why. Because first, Washington is disputed. Second, the P5+1 is disputed. And as long as we cannot bring consensus within Washington and within the P5+1, they would not be able to present a realistic face-saving solution, which includes the legitimate rights of Iran and lifting the sanctions. And then they can require whatever they like on transparency and breakout capability. I mean, Iran would be able, in such a package, to ensure the international community that Tehran would remain a non-nuclear weapon state forever.
Okay.
But Washington and Europeans, are they in position to launch such a great deal? I doubt it.
Dr. Mousavian, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much. All the best.